And my first comment, actually, I told Michael not to leave yet because he has to go back and teach another class. But I just wanted to sort of make the remark as I was sitting and listening to both Barrett and Michael. It's very humbling as a dean to listen to these very powerful faculty. It is absolutely amazing, and I am so appreciative of the work that they do. And I think both of them have said this, and I mean it very genuinely. Our interest in the college is really, and at the university, is really in engaging and developing our students so that we make a workforce that will add to your teams and be very powerful and effective. But at the same time, it is also asking the question, what can we be doing for the community? And so one of the things that I really wanted to basically query all of you about and ask you to please be in a conversation with us. What other kinds of workshops, symposium, lecture series, what else do you need to hear? What else do you need to learn about? Or how can we be helpful to you? You're out there helping in the community every single day, making difference to the patients. What can we be doing to support you? So please, email me your suggestions. My email is ksmatt, M-A-T-T, @udel.edu. So please be a partner with us. I think Barrett had said this as well as Michael. You teach us so much, but then whatever we can do to help and support you, we really want to be there for that. And again, I just want to really publicly thank both Michael and Barrett, and I know Barrett will be back up again speaking, but we really want to thank them. You're absolutely amazing, and you make us all stop and think about our days and about how to make them much more effective. So thank you very much. And I think with that, I'll give it back to Barrett.
That was nice. Now I have a chance to let you all down. Okay. All right. So we're going to continue this and talk about empathy, probably one of the most ambiguous concepts, but something that I've been doing research on since my early days in graduate school, and some of the information I'm going to share with you here on some of my own work, but also many others, and then how this relates, of course, to interprofessional collaborative practice. I'm also going to show a couple quick cartoony films that help kind of clear things out, and maybe you've seen them. So what is empathy? And the reason I have to kind of take this step back is because there is a lot of conceptual ambiguity surrounding empathy, specifically within the research and literature. And there are kind of two main frames. There's a social psychological perspective, kind of the general perspective, and then there's also this clinical perspective that comes up in the literature a lot as well. And they're similar, but conceptually different. And I'm going to expose those to you now. Now, from the social psychological perspective, I'm going to give you the model of how it works. Empathy stems from the recognition of another individual in distress. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have empathy for someone in a positive state. We often have experienced that where someone we're close to or someone we're not even close to, we can notice or recognize an emotional state that's positive in them, and actually we feel some of that as well. Right? We can do that. However, the best way to describe the model and how we often think about empathy is when someone else is experiencing some form of distress or a negative stressor in their life. And that's where it all starts, is recognizing that. So immediately we have a cognitive aspect, being able to understand what someone experiencing distress looks like through verbal and nonverbal cues. That can be challenging in terms of time and other things that are happening in our lives. That can be a real setback and a barrier to actually understanding that. The observer evaluates the expression of cues, like I said, nonverbal and verbal. Some of the more given ones, of course, someone crying or someone's facial cues with their face turned down, like in a frown, right? Those kind of things. Or huddled over. We can recognize body language. But oftentimes we lose sight on how to do that, or we just give up and we don't even try to acknowledge it. Oftentimes we see people and we just walk past them. We don't even acknowledge it because it costs us time and effort. Through shared meanings with our interaction partner, we recognize that the victim of the stressor is experiencing a negative affective state or negative emotional state, and that recognition cues the cognitive and emotional experience of empathy. From the social psychological perspective, empathy is not only cognitive, but also emotional. And that's one of the main differences between empathy from the social psych background and the clinical. What we're talking about here in terms of that emotional element is what we call emotional contagion. Contagion, just like contagious. That sharing of an emotional state with another person. A lot of times we forget that we do that. We actually have the ability to do that. And we don't necessarily have to consciously do that. It kind of happens. For some of us, you might feel it all the time. You might feel like you're highly empathic. Right? That when you see things, maybe it's a TV show. I can't watch certain TV shows because, like The Office, y'all remember The Office? I couldn't watch that show because it made me feel so awkward, because that was such an awkward interactions within them that I'd have to turn it off. Like, it really made me feel tough, and I couldn't watch it. You've probably seen that in movies, like, oh God, I can't watch, right? Because you might feel that similar state. You know what that feels like. That awkwardness brings it up inside of you. And sometimes it's sad movies. One of the reasons we cry at movies, right, is because that's triggering a negative emotional response in ourselves, right? That's what happens. It's all about an other-oriented nature, but also self-awareness, taking the perspective of the other person. Another way of phrasing it is putting yourself in the emotional shoes of another individual, another way of looking at it. And these are some quick quotes from some classic social psychological theorists that talk about empathy. The empathic process begins as a result of witnessing the emotional state of another person. He, the observer, comes to share that emotional state, an affective state stemming from the apprehension of another's emotional state or condition. Now, in the clinical perspective, we see something a bit different. From the clinical perspective, we see this emotional contagion getting taken out. There's not so much the sharing of emotional state, it's much more on the cognitive. It's recognition and acknowledgement of the patient's emotional state. So we add in that behavioral element as well. In the social psych literature, we don't really talk about a response. Empathy is an experience. The response is kind of a supportive behavior. But in the clinical literature, empathy shifts gears to focus mostly on that perspective taking and then that acknowledgement. And that's a challenge. And the reason it's a challenge in terms of these conceptual differences is that we're not talking about the same thing. And that means we don't really know what we're experiencing and what we're engaging in. There's a de-emphasis on connecting emotionally as patients, and why do you think that is? Well, fundamentally because empathy is a vulnerable process. By opening yourself up to the emotional states of others and you yourself experiencing a negative emotional state, that takes a toll on you. That creates wear and tear. So actually connecting in that way, as natural as it may seem for some of us, can actually take a toll on us. Other words that have been used in terms of clinical empathy have been neutral empathy, compassionate detachment, detached concern's a good one, and I always mess this up, but equanimity. All right, it's a little bit older, but I just saw it being used, oddly enough, with a mindfulness practice. I'm like, how dare you? Don't go in that direction, right? We got to talk about the social psychological aspect. Here are some more classic clinical empathy theorists. Sir William Osler back in the day, equanimity enables a physician to be outwardly and inwardly composed in the face of distress experienced by others, can only be achieved through an emotional detached position from the patient. The doctor is not emotionless in the face of patients, but trained well enough to actually detain his or her emotions during that process. It's from the 30s. We'll give it that little break. Detached concern. Now, Leaf and Fox, classic theorist. Empathic physician remains detached from the patient emotionally while balancing level of concern. Now, what's one thing that may stick out from you? I put these up purposefully. Anything stick out in terms of who are they speaking about? The physician. Clinical empathy, although has dabbled in the nursing literature, has been primarily put on the physician. The allotment of the physician to have this detachment. And to me, that's BS, right? Because we all experience the patient. In a primary care workforce, we're all experiencing the patient and the patient caregivers and our colleagues in some way. Does that mean that there is some special feeling that you're allowed to have because you're at this particular position? No. We all experience the physician and we all should be engaging in we all experience the patient and our colleagues. There should be some level of interaction. But also, like I said before, empathy can be spread out to our colleagues as well, not just the patient and the patient's caregivers. Dr. Hoja at our Thomas Jefferson University, some of you may be familiar with his work. He is probably the now prominent clinical empathy speaker. and writer, number of books, number of articles. I've actually worked with them myself. We significantly disagree about what empathy is, but we have a respectful disagreement. We both will exist in our own literatures. But again, the same kind of idea, a cognitive as opposed to affective. His words, not mine, attribute that involves an understanding of the inner experiences and perspectives of the patient, combined with the capability to communicate the understanding with the patient, that cognitive and behavioral. Now, Jodi Halpern has actually taken this in a different direction. And what I say is she walks the thin line with her idea of from detached concern to empathy, her idea of what clinical empathy is, right? A lot of it is on the imagining of how an experience feels, right? So it's kind of coming back. But another thing to focus on, not just the idea that this is predominantly on the doctor, but also a lot of it's focused on the patient, right? That empathic connection between the provider and the patient. There has been minimal, besides nursing, there has been minimal research in terms of other types of healthcare providers and that empathic connection to each other and with them, with the patient as well. So that's where we're missing. So conceptual differences, of course, are that emotional contagion, that sharing of emotional state, and that behavioral aspect of empathy that tends to come out in that clinical empathy. And I share these conceptions with, or conceptualizations with you, just so if you ever dabble in the literature or in some of the work, that you understand that there is a fundamental difference between them. So I'm gonna show these quick little films. I've been told this will work. Some of you may have seen these. Brene Brown's work, fantastic. I'd love to bring her to campus. The first one gives you a little bit of a background in terms of how I and a number of others in the social psych background tend to view empathy even in the healthcare fields. And then the second one relates blame to empathy, something that we probably all engage in not only at work but also at home. So I'm going to offer them up real quick.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. how many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I am a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And the first, a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of that story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the na thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
So those, I think, are really useful in terms of understanding. I like things like that are just like little quick 3-minute things that are especially cartoons. I'm like, oh, yes, digestible information, thank you. So these, I think, provide a good understanding of the fundamentals of empathy and then also how they relate to blame. Oftentimes, I know within my own work, before I actually understand or hold someone accountable, I'm more apt to say, they screwed me over. They did this. That's an immediate response because sometimes it's disgust or whatever, but it also comes from fear. It comes from fear of understanding our own roles and how we contribute to a team. We have to be more confident in our own selves in terms of what we do in order to actually engage in empathy. Oops, I moved fast a little bit. So, getting back to some fundamentals I talked about at the beginning of this whole program is, what is the value of empathy? Why do we care? It creates vulnerability. Right? It can be really challenging. There's a lot of barriers to it, which we'll go over in a second. But why do we actually care about engaging with our colleagues in terms of collaborative care, and also our patients and their caregivers? Well, I brought these up before, and the research shows, and I provide a bunch of sites, although I can see that last site is not totally complete. I will get that to you. The cool thing about these sites, and the research that shows this, is that it's consistent. It doesn't take a break in like the 90s or 2000s. It actually goes all the way through into current times, into the late 2010s. Patients who perceive their provider to be empathic report higher satisfaction. That means more money in a value-based care model in terms of reimbursements. We're talking bottom line stuff, right? Higher rate of compliance with doctor suggestions. Oftentimes, now the research I had, the reason I have doctor there and not other providers, because that's where that research is. It hasn't done other providers yet. That's where it should go. Better physical and mental health outcomes, and providers that have higher rates of empathy actually have lower rates of burnout. They have now you'd think that's that doesn't go together, right? Well, if I'm going to be more vulnerable and accepting more emotional states than of others, especially the negative emotional states, then how am I not more succumbing to, or more likely to succumb to burnout? It's actually some building of resilience in terms of your ability and willingness to acknowledge and be authentic with your own emotional states. Think about how much more work it is to fake it, right? That's the key. That amount of energy you put in, possibly, maybe not all of you do this, I know I do, right? To fake it in the emotional sense instead of trying to actually do it for real and be authentic. That's more harmful to your insides and physiologically and to your relationships than actually engaging in authentic empathy. Higher rates of reimbursement, like I said, lower rates of burnout, I already mentioned that, and higher rates of collaboration. So having more empathy and being more empathic actually lends itself to higher rates of interprofessional collaborative practice. So relating this to interprofessional collaborative practice, of course, empathy can allow us to understand the needs, to be more aware of our patients and our coworkers and our colleagues. Adaptability regarding conflict, like Mike talked about. Some of this stuff that Mike talked about and I'm talking about should really ring true on both sides. Ability to take others' perspectives. And one of the things that's most interesting about empathy is that as we practice it, as we engage in it, it actually enhances our self-awareness and our other orientation. So it's twofold. Not only does it allow us to understand our own ability to recognize others' emotional states and where we may fall short, but also allows us to be more aware of others around us. And it isn't just, as I said before, for patients, right? We can use empathy to think about others, the providers in our team. All of you that are here today, probably one of the reasons you're here today is you might probably have a pretty high baseline of empathy. I'm just assuming. But it allows us to see the roles of those we work with in a different way. And where the roles might overlap, provides us enhanced shared understandings in communication and language, as well as enhancing psychological safety, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Oftentimes we see roles within our primary care like this. Each of us exist on a team, but we have our own individual role to play. Enhanced empathy and the ability to practice it actually allows us to see it more like that. So I was at Emory University for my undergrad and grad, and while I was there, he's still there, there's a fantastic scholar named Frans de Waal. Some of you may have seen his work. He's also in kind of more run-of-the-mill kind of periodicals like Time and Newsweek and stuff like that. He was at Yerkes, which is a primate research center at Empathy. He does do empathy. On Primate Research Center at Emory. There we go. And one of the things that really struck me about his work, I just had some conversations with him when I was going through my dissertation, which happened to be on empathy. And this part of his book really kind of struck me. We're pre-programmed to reach out. He's an evolutionary biologist by trade, evolutionary anthropologist and primate geneticist. Empathy is an automated response over which we have limited control. We can suppress it, mentally block it, or fail to act on it. But except for a tiny percentage of humans known as psychopaths, and to some extent sociopaths, no one is emotionally immune to another's situation. The fundamental yet rarely asked question is why natural selection designed our brains so that we're in tune with our fellow human beings, feel distress at their distress, and pleasure at their pleasure. If exploitation of others were all that mattered, evolution should never have gotten into the empathy business. So what he's basically arguing is that at the most fundamental level, we all have the ability to, or most of us have the ability to engage in some form of empathy. So it's good. That's good news for all of us. Taking a more macro perspective, right? Some of you may have been able to have a chance to read Jeremy Rifkin's book, Empathic Civilization. Maybe not. It's huge. It puts me to bed. But the general point of this is that he moves from this idea of kind of like where Frans de Waal starts and talks about how empathy can be used to enhance further connections. So to empathize is to civilize. So this social historical extension of connectedness that we may feel that started off with just our familiar ties, with those that are close to us. It can move in terms of what he talks about, religious ties and political affiliations and things like that, and national sense of origins. But he pushes it even farther and says, what if, honestly, if empathy could push us all the way to actually connecting with human race writ large, right? And that's what we're trying to do to some extent, is foster those connections. If we're all born with this ability, to some extent, all of us, born with this ability, why can't it reach out that far? And let's take it a step back. Is it really a big stretch to connect our empathy with those we work with? How often do we actually engage in empathy with our coworkers and our colleagues? How often do we actually do that, right? And I want you to think about that a little bit. Because there are a number of barriers to engaging in empathy. Number one is sympathy. Sympathy is, for lack of a better phrase, a cop-out. Now, I'm not saying it's bad, but in terms of engaging in empathy, it's a lot even to feel for someone rather than feel with someone. And sometimes that can be very safe. Now, I don't deal with patients every day, so it's very easy for me to say, oh, you should be connecting with people all the time. But again, that authenticity is what matters. Sympathy, that feeling for, can be a bit detrimental in relationships often, right? So barriers that we may experience. Well, I like to phrase empathy as a foreign language or a muscle. If you don't practice it, you're going to lose it. Also, statistical analysis. I am terrible at stats. If I don't do stats for a while, I have to go up and pick up a book and retrain myself. Empathy is a very similar thing, right? If we don't practice it, we're going to lose it. We have societal barriers, gender norms, those types of things, institutional barriers. Our actual organizations may not provide us the time to allow us to do that. They're all constraints to the ability and willingness to connect with someone on this level, but also the ability and willingness to actually recognize somebody else's emotional state, right? We just might move too quickly. Social norms, our capability, the effort it takes, the time it takes, and that idea of vulnerability. We're often in a state of constant self-preservation. There's a great theory out there called conservation of resources theory. And basically the idea is, and Mike phrased it as sprinkling stress. If you're like me, sometimes someone's taken the top off and you put on that little seasoning and all of a sudden all of the stress is on my life, right? All of that stuff can happen. And when that happens, we're less likely to take that time and effort to connect with the other person. So I'm going to give you kind of 5 or 6 practices. And what I'm going to argue is that you kind of try these at home first. But you can try them at work too. And some of you may already engage in this. But these are ways in which to build empathy for your family, your partners, but also your colleagues, and then your clients, patients, and their caregivers, right? So 3 assumptions. Right, this relates to building trustworthiness. Mike talked a lot about trust. Trust and empathy go hand in hand. Assume that everyone on your practice team is there to serve the greater good. I don't know how many times I've walked into meetings where I know someone's going to be there. I'm like, that person's out to get me. They're going to say something, or I get an email. The best is the email. Like, why would you say that? Now I must put another email back to you, and let's start down that destructive path, right? It'd be a lot easier, and this is something I try to practice every day, if we walked into this idea of trust. If we assumed that within our meetings, within our own teams, that everyone was there. Just assume that everyone is there to serve the greater good, which is patient outcomes, right? And betterment of our team environment. Just try that. It seems so, just try it. Given that assumption, you can therefore assume that none of us have a hidden agenda. Oh, imagine if we took that out of our daily repertoire. I know for me personally, that's, again, something I work on. Given the above assumption, we therefore assume that we're all reasonable even when we disagree. And that's where it becomes, when that conflict shows its head, right? We have to kind of stay on this path of, I trust you. We're actually in this together. And that's a hard thing to do sometimes. Another way of practicing empathy, and Mike brought this up, I'm going to give it a little bit more of a touch, all right, is this mindfulness and empathic listening, right? You guys can all practice it a little bit. I went to a seminar one time just on mindful listening, and I started to realize what a terrible listener I am. Terrible. I felt immediately bad for my wife, because I'm like, oh my God, how often do I just immediately, when someone's talking, do I just jump the gun? I'm already thinking about my response. Like, you're maybe 2 sentences, I'm like, I got this. Wait for that breath. Come on, give me that breath. Yes, mine, got it. Right? And I have not heard a word. And so I often think about this in terms, like I said, with my wife. How often, and now what I try to do is I sit down and I try to listen, all right? I try to give the person the gift of some airtime, open up my ears. And when, just like in terms of like meditation and things like that, when you feel your attention slipping, bring it right back. This is a really hard practice. Now, I say do this at home and with your friends and family, right? Some of the things, I have, in one of my classes, my intro sociology class, I have 250 students, and I give them kind of exercises to do as homework. One of my favorite ones is when we do emotional norms, right? And how you're supposed to respond to somebody when they give an emotional state to you, and so do the exact opposite. So if someone comes with you really good news, be like, I'm really sorry to hear that, right? And they flip out, they don't know how to go because we're so used to practicing these kind of repetitions, this pattern of interaction. We know how to respond. So they come back and be like, oh yeah, totally turned everything upside down. Try this with friends and family and actually sit and listen. Give them the airtime. You can acknowledge, but try not to over-acknowledge. Let the person, and see if you actually hear what they're trying to say. Now, the more you practice this, just like a muscle, the more you practice this, the more you can translate that into your everyday work environment as well. It can be very hard and challenging to do this at work in such time constraints. So the goal really is to practice this at home in a personal setting and then build up those exercises, those muscles. Empathic listening is actually listening more for emotions rather than content, all right? That's another kind of step. We've talked a lot about Google today. It's funny, Mike and I come from different backgrounds. We didn't plan this talk together. We planned it separately, and yet we both end up talking about Google. So mad props to Google. Clearly they know something's going on. How many of you saw the recent New York Times piece on their bit about teams and how they work well together? Good for you. I put the link right there. Okay? And then I've also put Amy Edmondson's TED Talk right there as well. One of the most interesting things that Google found in their own research about what makes teams work is one of the key things with psychological safety within teams. Now, I told you we'd talk about touchy-feely stuff, but this is really important. Psychological safety, individuals' perception of the consequences of taking an interpersonal risk or belief that a team is safe for risk-taking in the face of being seen as ignorant, incompetent, negative, or disruptive. It's an opportunity for individuals to feel as though they have a voice. I don't know how many of you maybe picked up on it. I know I picked up on it because I saw the script beforehand. But in that scenario, if anyone saw the front desk individual coming back and sitting with the team, and then almost trying to interject and then taking a step back, not being allowed to interject. Everyone should feel, if they're a part of a team, the ability, regardless of occupation, the ability to interject or say something, to add their own ideas about what's going on. So teams have to create that psychological safety, or that things could get slipped through. That's where medical errors happen, right? That's where we drop the continuity of care, when not everyone's on the same page and feels the ability to talk and take risks. Now, the next two practices I'm gonna give are a little bit different. All right, this one's a little bit more for people like me who love sociology and theory, all right, but I'll give you the general background. It's basically how we view our in and out groups, right? Groups that we're a part of because of belongings that we have and how they impact our own personal identity. In and out groups are usually viewed through our cognitive representations, and they're done in the literature in three ways: personalization, common in-group, and mutual intergroup differentiation. We're not going to worry about the last one. That's a ton in the literature, but the new research has found that if we engage in personalization and common in-group identity as well, these aren't mutually exclusive, we can actually decrease stereotypes, decrease negative expectations of group members, and actually engage in this we-ness. So these are new ways of viewing ourselves and our groups. So personalization is you decrease the salience of differentness within the group. So within your own practice teams, you decrease the differentness in terms of roles that people play, titles they may have. And you enhance that personhood. We're all underneath this larger personhood, right? Common in-group identity is very similar, but takes it a little step differently. You don't kind of blur those individual roles that we play, but we focus on the more supra-identity. We're all part of this practice. We're all healthcare workers, right? And in doing so, we kind of see the belongingness and the connectedness with each other. This next one is tough, and this is where I'm at right now in terms of my own attempts to enhance my empathy, and that's organizational awareness. This is connecting your personal feelings as well as those around you in terms of understanding those and how those relate to other workers and how that speaks to the entire tapestry that is your organization. That is a little harder to do. Now, some of us great leaders are able to do this, right? They're able to kind of see all the connections before they happen. I know I've had some people that are leaders that see 10 steps down the road in terms of that big organizational speak. That's where we want to try to get. As we increase kind of our individual, our micro level empathy, we can actually be able to do this. And you all have these slides and can practice these as well. And at the most fundamental level, there is formal training out there. And some of this is actually specific to the healthcare workforce. So Dr. Helen Reese out of Harvard has developed this, Empathetics. It is a series of training modules specifically for the healthcare workforce in terms of enhancing their empathy. Paul Ekman out of UCLA, some of you may be familiar with his work. He's semi-retired, right? He and his team have developed ways in which training modules to identify micro expressions, so things in your face that help identify your own affective state. We are using these modules now at University of Delaware to help train our undergraduate health pre-professionals. We talked about wanting to train our next phase of the healthcare workforce. We're starting at the basics, and we're building up from there. Doesn't mean you can't start now. It just means that we're trying to take a step back a little bit farther. So in conclusion, I think Mike would have agreed with me if he would stick around, but practice doesn't make perfect by any means. Practice makes better. And there are certain things that we consider, like I said, these softer skills that actually can enhance the fundamental elements of positive practice behavior. Kindness, mindfulness, self-awareness, receptivity. But one of the things, the key thing I want to leave you with is this, my favorite phrase in the world, culture eats strategy for lunch. So no matter how many times you and your colleagues may take these training modules, or you may try to practice a new initiative in collaborative practice, unless you're existing within an umbrella of culture that provides opportunities to do this, it's not going to do anything, right? It's going to be dead in the water every time. So you have to really work at impacting that institutional culture, which some of you, all of you have the ability to do. All right, with that, I'll take any questions that you may have. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I got you.
So I just have some comments. So my doctoral dissertation, similar to yours, was on emotional intelligence. Back in 2004, I got really interested in it because I was a nurse manager in Philly. You don't hear my Philly accent at all, I'm sure. So I would have nurses that were not very emotionally intelligent at the bedside with patients. I was a nurse manager of a trauma unit at Einstein in Philly, level 1. And, we dealt with a very difficult and challenging clientele. And the nurses would sometimes lose it. So I had to look into what was available in the employee assistance program, and all there was like anger management. So I started to research social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and I actually put my nurses through an emotional intelligence course to kind of get that self-awareness, develop the empathy for these patients who, yes, they were, for lack of a better term, criminals, but they still deserved care. They had to be cared for, and to be non-judgmental and provide the care that they needed. If they, despite the fact that they were in the middle of a drug deal, if they had respirations, they had a level of pain that they were describing, give them their pain medicine, So I actually got really interested in the emotional intelligence aspect. I wound up moving to Delaware, long story. And I actually studied for my dissertation. I was going to use that population of nurses at Einstein, but I actually used 198 students at Del Tech, okay, all the campuses, and did a pre and post study on emotional intelligence levels. And it was really cool. We were able to put them through a course, have a test and a control group, put them through a course. And the main reason I got into this was because I saw that lack of emotional intelligence on the care of nurses and docs and other providers as well. But I also know, being trained back in the 80s as a nurse, that we were taught to hold back our emotions. I worked in a level 1 trauma center as a flight nurse, and I probably had like emotional breakdowns all the time talking to patients and families about organ donation. So I actually got out of that because I was so burnt out because I had to hold in my emotions. And what I saw was when I did break down was when sometimes the parents and families would actually try to coddle me, but they felt better, but I was told, you shouldn't do that. You're falling apart. How are you going to take care of the patient? So I do, now I am involved with teaching at Christiana that emotional intelligence piece. And I really think that is what's missing, not just on the part of nursing and health professionals, but also frontline care, civil servants. Certain people in politics today, I won't say any names, are missing that emotional intelligence, and they're not self-aware. They can't be aware of other people's feelings and react appropriately sometimes, or they're so emotionally they don't have any emotional contagion at all, that they are holding things in, and nobody feels that they are empathetic, so they're ineffective as a leader. So I'm sorry if I took so long in explaining that, but yeah, so it's definitely missing. I love that you talked about this. We actually had a Diamond Leadership course at Christiana given by all of our senior leaders at Christiana, and they are teaching the same thing: empathy, psychological safety. Okay, and hopefully they'll allow us to have that kind of environment. And lastly, one of our core values, which Honey and I, our favorite core value that we have new core values at Christiana, is assume good intentions. So, and you had that in your talk, where you got to assume that people are coming in, because if you assume the wrong thing about them, even when they're being brave and being risk takers and putting it out there, you got to allow that psychological safety and assume that what they're doing is for the patient and the organization. So,
great. I'm glad to see. I've heard this before, that Christiana is putting some of these things in practice. And I just had talked to Lisa Maxwell, who's the head over at Residency for Family and Community Medicine, and she had mentioned doing something like this for the residents as well. So there is this kind of integration. It can be a challenge, though, right? This idea of emotional sharing the emotional state, and that creating that vulnerability can be detrimental. But when you do hold it back, right, it becomes hard. It almost becomes more work, internal work, to actually do that. Yes.
Yeah, I'm very interested that I didn't realize there was so much education on empathy. I've read about it, but I didn't realize it was going on in so many different places. But one of the things that I've observed over the years as a teacher also, I taught middle and high school, and then working as a nurse, is that there's such variation in human development and their ability to empathize. And we think of the Big Bang Theory and Sheldon Cooper, and he's a perfect example of somebody on maybe the autism spectrum. And I've met a lot of very intelligent people, and they're very capable. And sometimes they just don't they don't tend to connect the dots all the time. And it's not because they don't want to care. They need to be educated. So I just find that to be very interesting. So it's not just, and I would see that with students. Sometimes they'd say, why do I have to do that? She wants to measure in this lab. It's just very interesting. It can be a challenge, but I just thought that was variability.
And some of the things, and I had some slides up on this, but it can get a little too deep in the weeds, is when you talk about kind of the neuroanatomy of empathy and where it occurs and where some of the other barriers might be. You talk about autism spectrum, especially moving over towards Asperger's, right? And that's where we see, what's interesting is, have anyone here heard of mirror neurons? Okay, mirror neurons are kind of big. There's actually a little bit of debate now if this is as big as they say. But the general idea with mirror neurons is it's actually a funny kind of happenstance of science. So there was an Italian group studying, I forget which kind of monkeys, but monkeys, and they were seeing the brain waves that were happening when a monkey was opening a nut, right? And so they saw that, okay, when he opens this nut, this part of his brain is activating. And interesting enough, just one of the researchers went over and wanted one of the nuts, and so went over, but the monkey was still hooked up to the sensors. And so they found when the other researcher grabbed that nut and opened it up, the same sensors in the monkey lit up again, as if the monkey itself was doing the work. And it discovered this idea of mirror neurons, and that we all kind of have this ability, and that idea of monkey see, monkey do, right? We have this ability, it lets up in our brain when we see other people experience things we know of. Right? So that's a big thing. We found that people with Asperger's syndrome actually don't have the same development in that area, or the area of the brain in which empathy occurs. What's also interesting, and more research needs to be done about this, is experience-driven empathy. So you have to have those experiences in order to really understand what it's like, right? And that's a real challenge. We have a really difficult time understanding those who are different than, right? And that's where our challenge in terms of empathizing becomes. That's why changing those group representations and being able to explore those other experiences, we don't like to get out of our comfort zone, but we often need to, right? So those types of things. And also the ability to recognize emotional cues in other people. That's not the easiest thing in the world, all right? We can definitely get misled sometimes. I mean, oftentimes we misread cues. That's something we can always hone up on as well. So you bring up very good points. I think this is something why at UD we're trying to do this, is really give our students a fighting chance and practicing that all the way through their education and training, right? Okay, any other questions or points? Sure.
So I was wondering about practical situation, like the second video. So I am a husband, that's my wife, and I am trying to emphasize, but all I see is the hostility and anger, and I don't understand the reason for that. Like, it doesn't make sense for me. And do I have to get into the same state to emphasize? No, right? So how do you deal with that?
That's a really good point. And so this happens, so for me personally, this happens all the time. And usually it's me and my wife engages in more empathic listening than I do. And so the idea would be to listen, right, is to take a step out. Sometimes I like to look at myself as I'm not that important. So I try to take myself out of a situation and listen and not put myself in terms of my feelings, what's happening. Usually empathy is kind of an unconscious kind of experience, right? So, but when I start to feel, hey, she's angry at me, she's doing this, I can tend to think of, what is happening? What is she feeling? So that empathic listening, what are these emotions stemming from? What is the context in which this exists? And then I can, when I engage in that listening, I can perhaps offer, if I need to, any kind of perspective from my end. But that idea of, I know what it is like to feel anger, let me feel what that might be like from her perspective, right? That can be a challenge. It can be really hard. Again, that time and effort and vulnerability it causes, I mean, it just, that wear and tear. But again, the more we practice, the more authentic it becomes, the more ease of nature it is, right? Does that help a little bit? Yeah. Okay. Any other? Okay, oh, let me go. I'll go here and then there, okay? Yeah.
But the great thing about working with an organization is that they teach you how to become servant leaders. But things have moved to my perspective where I'm now being part of a practice transformation network wherein we teach community resources, providing them with team-based care, helping the clinicians be at the top of their license, practicing at the top of their license, but also teaching them how to engage with patients as well as their families, and at the same time bring joy to the practice. But I think the major component that we're missing with helping these practices is empathy, and I appreciate for your talk about it, because what I'm going to do right now is that once I come back with the community practices that I actually we help with, would be teaching them empathy. And, this is just a feedback, but thank you very much.
I had a question. I'm wondering if, like, the history of health promotion and, like, the focus on patient education and individual choice around behavior, do you see that as a help or a hindrance to providers embracing empathy?
I mean, I could go, so tonight I have to teach my graduate class in medical sociology. You can't hear it. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
So on Tuesday nights, I teach my graduate class in medical sociology, and I swear that would be a 4-hour discussion right there. I could draw mind maps all over the place right here. I wish I had whiteboards everywhere, because that's huge. It's a really big topic. I don't know how to condense this, so I'm going to do the best I can. So we can think about some movements like patient activation, consumer movement in healthcare, all of these things that have been information age, that have been challenges in terms of providing adequate care, the rise of the managed care movement, right? All of these things have made major impacts. They have condensed the ability to make those connections between providers and patients and front desk and patients. Yet we think that through patient activation, we're providing more ownership and responsibility onto the patient, And for some extent, we might think that may translate into better connections, but there's something lost in that translation. You might have heard a lot of talk, it's mostly been in the medical education realm about professionalism and renewing this social contract that they may have with the public. This is just an opportunity to get back to basics. I think this is what's happening. I think all these movements that have come up, all these structural and more meso and macro level impacts that have impacted that dyad or that care relationship, I think now people are saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Everything's gone. Everything's moved right past us. Let's take a step back and let's get back to basics. I think that's where we're at right now, both from a patient level who's calling for more empathy and more compassion and care, right? But we don't live in a structure that can do that. So we have to back it up and say, okay, how can we formulate and restructure the organizations, the practices? This is what we're doing here, right? This is what we're doing right now. Is the whole goal of this entire program is to restructure it to get to that point. And it's not just in terms of, connecting and make sure the patient feels satisfied. It's also in terms of health outcomes, reducing the costs, but also increasing provider and healthcare worker well-being. Right? So that's all fits in this big thing. Man, I wish I had like a whole day with y'all. It'd be great, I promise. But I saw one last thing over here, and then I'm going to hand it off.
Breaking the barrier, giving a tech comment. So I wonder about technology, the phone, because if being empathetic requires you to either, you're looking at body gestures, eye contact, and those really, and then what's being said, the tone, but now you have texting. And my wife and I, she got a text the other day. We were going to a concert. It was easier for her to get a lift from some friends that were going. She texted the friend, said, "Can I get a lift?" She said, "Oh, I didn't realize you were going," which upset her. And I was like, well, she's just commenting she didn't realize we were going. But she was upset by it. And I was like, it's just take it at the, she doesn't have a facial expression. She doesn't have a tone of voice. So
you bring up a great point. And so text. Emails are the best, right? Oh, emails are the best. Oh, emails just killed us. But also, of course, electronic health records. That's another one of the kind of daggers in this. Now, they are advancing our ability for continuity of care, but at the same point, they do provide a divide between connecting with the patient. We saw in this scenario that the patient didn't bring her meds, but that they should be on record. That would be helpful. That would be very helpful, right? That's a great place where it provides that element. But we've seen a lot of studies come out where providers, whether they be nurse practitioners, nurses, doctors, even front desk staff, kind of tick, 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 and it's over there. It's another screen barrier, right? So I think after this usher, in terms of connecting on electronic health records, we may move forward in terms of how to foster those connections after that. But we do live in a digital age. So how do we work within that structure is kind of how we have to exist now. All right, I'm going to go take a step just for time. I'm going to hand it off real quick to Rita Landgraf, who is the former DHSS secretary, also a new faculty here at the College of Health Sciences. We couldn't be more excited. Also the director or co-director, director of the UD Partnerships and Healthy Communities. And so I'm going to hand it off to her, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. Let's give Barrett a round of applause. That was just fantastic. I hope that you have enjoyed this morning. My job here is to wrap things up and inform you about next steps. And you heard earlier from Dean Matt about some of the changes that have occurred relative to Delaware's health transformation and our state innovation plan. Delaware was very successful 4 years ago. Because of the Affordable Care Act, an office was created called the Center for Medicaid Medicare Innovation. And billions of dollars were put into that office to look at how do we innovate and reach the triple aim, now +1, the provider experiences. How do we innovate stateside and create these best practices that might occur based on the diversity of our states? And Delaware was very successful in actually designing a plan through the engagement of a broad set of stakeholders. Over hundreds of people actually participated in developing a plan for Delaware's transformation. Because of the plan, the Center for Medicaid Medicare Innovation actually gave Delaware $35 million to test our plan. And that testing has been going on for 4 years. We have 1 year left in our state innovation model. And when we look at what we have accomplished, it's actually a very aspirational plan. Part of one of the goals was to make Delaware one of the 5 healthiest states in the nation. We are currently, by health rankings, 31st in our health outcomes. So indeed, a high bar was set. I believe that's good. We should always strive to have that highest bar set, but we still have a lot of work to do. And part of that work was really looking at the pay-for-value model and how do we incentivize to actually promote better health outcomes, better patient experiences, while we actually drive down the cost of our health care. The state of Delaware, now that grant is administered through our Healthcare Commission, and they're really looking at how do we drive that payment piece. So what you see here is they're looking at how do we accelerate that payment piece through what they are projecting is a healthcare benchmark. If you look at the state of Massachusetts, they utilize a benchmark framework. Delaware's cost per capita, we're like the 4th highest cost in the states. Massachusetts is actually the highest. And so about 3 years ago, they transitioned to what they're calling as a benchmark to keep healthcare cost more in alignment with the gross domestic product. So Delaware's looking at actually facilitating a similar process here, and Secretary Walker, Dr. Walker, who's now the Secretary of the Department of Health and Social Services, is actually in charge of facilitating this accelerated benchmark. So the funding that we have left in our state innovation model is largely going to be dedicated towards how do we drive that pay for performance, that pay for value in an accelerated fashion. That's why you heard Dean Matt talk that this morning, that the grant dedicated to workforce development now, today is the end of our official workforce development relative to the state innovation model. However, the University of Delaware is in the business, especially our College of Health Sciences, but in interdisciplinary approach to developing our workforce. So we are still very committed, as best as we can without this funding, to continue to promote workforce development for our community workforce and, of course, for our future workforce based on our engagement with our students. So what we have presented to you around the table is that we want to continue as best that we can to offer opportunities for the community, for our students to come together and really continue these conversations on healthcare, on well-being, and on prevention. And you see we have a number of those opportunities throughout our year. At the UD and really looking at our own wellness and what we provide for our employees here, but also leveraging that to invite the community. And we've had, these conversations right here at STAR, and the community comes in. So we really welcome your level of engagement. The diversity of that really brings forth meaningful conversations and how we can continue to use our voice as Delaware continues to transform our healthcare delivery system. And if you go on the Healthcare Commission's website, or even if you go to the Department of Health and Social Services and find the Healthcare Commission's website, you will see a draft report called Delaware's Road to value. And this is the planning that the current administration has, a draft plan relative to how they wish to proceed in rolling out Delaware's Road to Value and recommendations for this transformation. You heard me talk about the accelerated benchmark, but there's other goals in here and recommendations that are in alignment with many of the things that you heard this morning. Improve healthcare quality and cost is one strategy. Pay for value is part of that strategy. Support patient-centered coordinated care will continue to be a value relative to our health transformation work. Prepare and support for health provider workforce and healthcare infrastructure needs. Improve health for special populations. Engage communities is still a goal for that transformation work, and ensure data-driven performance. It's not a lengthy report, so I encourage all of you to take a look at it. The state is asking for public comment, so we would encourage you to provide public comment. If you think workforce development in this framework provides value, please include that in your comments. And those comments are due November the 13th. So again, it's on the Delaware Healthcare Commission website. You actually have to go to the bottom in maroon, and you'll see that it'll say Delaware Road to Value. Public comment is being solicited. So please provide your voice. We have come a long way as a state, convening stakeholders to do this planning work and to implement a transformation plan. We want your voice as part of that transformation, and actually to carry this further beyond the grant of the state innovation model. So again, we will continue to look at opportunities even without that funding to promote workforce development, but we believe that it's critically important that all those things align, whether it's population health with the work of the Healthy Neighborhoods under the Delaware Center for Health Innovation, now the work UD's doing under Healthy Communities, aligning together to bring forth more from a population health outcome, whether it's workforce development, supporting our current workforce, but also thinking ahead. What will healthcare look like 10 years from now? It's an evolving environment. How do we get ahead of that? So we're actually providing the level of education and support to be ready 10 years down the road when, inclusive of technology continues to evolve. And how do we engage our patients and consumers in meaningful ways to actually be totally engaged with becoming healthier and as they engage with the healthcare system. So thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for being with us all through this workforce development work. And, that is also why Bhavna had put those sheets on your table, because if you fill out that sheet and want to be notified when we have additional workforce development opportunities, we will make certain that you are. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and thank you for being with us today. Evaluation?
Yeah, and if you'd like to receive CME credits,